Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the College at Florim's 7th Annual Green Day celebration as we go green to celebrate our beautiful campus, country, and world. I'm Matthew Fusia. I'm a junior chemistry major here at FDU. Hope you've enjoyed the Green Fair and the various workshops we've hosted so far. We are fortunate to have with us today the contributing editor for politics and investigations for WNYC News, NPR's New York affiliate, Mr. Bob Hennelly. Mr. Hennelly is an award-winning investigative journalist and has reported on a wide range of topics, from Homeland Security to Atlantic City's power outages following Superstorm Sandy to fights between New Jersey's towns and the state over utility taxes. But his true love lies within environmental politics, and today we have the special privilege of hearing Mr. Hennelly talk about suburban sprawl and the environmental effects of Superstorm Sandy. Without further delay, I present to you Mr. Bob Hennelly.
I'm going to record myself. That's a switch. Normally I'm recording other people. So I'm going to offer you, this is going to be a mixture of poetry and speech making on Earth Day, which I think is kind of appropriate. I really appreciate this opportunity to come and speak with you about New Jersey's post-Sandy challenge of facing our land use legacy before the next superstorm. Today I'm going to also talk about globalism, localism, and what I call the poetics of geographic remembrance and the essential value of knowing what environmental conditions existed in a place before it was developed. We always assume the big environmental challenges and epic struggles are in remote locations like the Brazilian rainforest. But after Sandy, we need to take a look around our own region and take responsibility for the poor land use choices we have made and continue to make. But before I get into the substance of my talk today, I want to give you a sense of how it is I come to know what I know about New Jersey, the region, and the environment. I'm the oldest of 6, raised mostly in a single-parent household. At the age of 13, I met my first elected official when Bergen County Sheriff Joe Job handed me the foreclosure papers in our family home on a cul-de-sac in Glen Rock, New Jersey. In the late 1960s, my father was having a difficult time continuing to make a living in the textile industry, which was increasingly being shifted to the other side of the world. We moved to rental housing in Ramsey, New Jersey, where I went to high school and started working at the Ramsey Mahwah Reporter, covering planning board meetings. I got paid 10 cents an inch and $5 for each photo I took. At the time, the Route 17 corridor was becoming increasingly commercialized, and I reported on the conversion of orchards, swamps, and forests to strip malls and cul-de-sacs. The proponents of the projects always said, by embracing development, municipal officials would keep local residential property taxes down while bringing in new commercial ratables to help pay for the ever-rising cost of local public education. But over the years, the opposite generally happened. The developers often got tax breaks as inducements, and the impact of more residential and commercial buildings was felt in additional services and infrastructure required from the local government. I also observed the linkage between political contributions and the land use process that was supposed to be about finding the so-called highest and best use for the land, which rarely ever included the option of just leaving it in its natural state. I wrote about how real estate developers, concrete companies, and contractors flooded county political organizations with campaign cash in a political economy that the general public was mostly ignorant of, even as the natural resource base was being devoured all around them. When it was time to go to college, I applied to only one place, a new state college nearby called Ramapo. Tuition was under $400, and my summer abroad was spending 40 hours a week in the freezer room of the ShopRite in Ramsey. Ramapo College was committed to providing us with an interdisciplinary education that encouraged us to see the connections between academic disciplines. I gravitated to journalism and environmental studies. And this is also where I think I started getting this idea of, being connected, this poetics of geographic remembrance, the idea of using words and images and the sense of what a place had been to understand the natural world. This is a piece called Steel on Steel. Steel on steel, sparks cut through, autumn early dark, blue steel, supported by iron rust, history lore from railroad empire days, steel on steel, railroad ties with past, splinters of what they were, memory now nostalgia, nostalgia now gone. Steel on steel, no trains run through here late night, no more steel on steel, only wind blows through tunnels, old men, retired railroad brakemen, rock on wide floorboards of porches still holding convictions, way up the line waiting for steel on steel, or the spark, the horn blaring echoes of a sympathetic history. Steel on steel, blue steel on memory rust of the railroad, a daydream, train clanging, memory turned to dust. Still they stare off past tripping, but not idle, waiting for an old friend whose time lives on in the telling of the tale. Though track beds laid with sweat and precision merge with landscape undetected, as a well-receded path recedes, nature taking land back, saplings shoot up between ties. Weeds swallow switches, ads peel off billboards, steel on steel, now nothing more than a dull distant sound, blurred by confusion called progress. Steel on steel, rushing rhythm passed on from another time, to children young enough to listen, sitting by old men, retired railroad brakemen, spewing rocking chair legacy, waiting patiently for the return of steel on steel, hand-picked spike rail, knowing that they, hand in hand, made steel glide on steel, now grinding gone. Those are some professors. Our professors encouraged us to engage in the real world, and we got involved with the local mayors and environmental groups in towns like Franklin Lakes that were trying to stop the completion of the segment of I-287 that spanned from Montville to Mahwah, the New York State line and New York State Thruway. Now that may be new for some people, but at one time, I-287 just stopped there. And there were public hearings to determine the potential environmental impact of the highway. We found subject matter experts and local residents who knew the landscape intimately. We also learned that one of the rationales for locating Ramapo College on the Birch Estate in Mahwah was that the state's long-term planners thought it would make it easier to assemble the right-of-way for the highway. That was insightful. We tried to make the case that by completing the highway, portions of the region's water-producing highlands that we're in now would be placed under increasing development pressure and degradation. Our experts also predicted that the increase in impervious surfaces, pavements, driveways, that comes with the highway and the development that follows would shortly be quick to short cycle the water cycle, and then producing more flooding and what's called non-point source pollution. That's the contamination from lawn chemicals and motor oil off the roadways that comes with sprawl. But I learned early how government works when the fix is in. We were told that the point of the hearing was to only consider the impact of just the highway. The development that might happen after the highway's completion was not under consideration. It would be the province of the local municipal authorities. So imagine how not surprised I was when decades later, working for WNYC, covering Irene, when a raging Rockaway River carried a huge chunk of I-287 away in Bhutan. Amazing. It's a blessing to live long enough to see the public be correct. But being a reporter has been only part of my education. Also essential to my ecological orientation to how the earth worked was working in a wide array of jobs while I continued writing and learning. helping to build homes, installing septic systems, yes, even clear cutting for gravel mining, all taught me directly how what we do impacts the natural world around us. In Orange County, New York, I clear cut a fir tree stand to install a vineyard, taking several acres from forest to farm. On my 29th birthday, I shoveled a semi-tractor trailer load of chicken excrement so we could get a nitrogen fix for the soil. On the shores of Lake Michigan, I worked in a crew that moved homes back from the shoreline because of the rising lake levels. It's hard to imagine now, but I was the guy with a sledgehammer that would go under the house and knock out the cinder block foundation as quickly as I could so we could move the house to higher ground. So I know firsthand that what we see at first blush on the landscape can be deceiving. Now, this was a period I went out to Michigan. I had all this intention of saving the planet one farm at a time. I got 20 acres of house and a barn for $34,000, and I didn't realize the price was low because I needed to bring all the money I'd ever need with me to live because it was impossible to make a living. So I did all kinds of very strange jobs. I worked in a lumber mill. I wrote theater and music criticism for the Traverse City Record Eagle, all these things at the same time. And this is a piece about, I also did a lot of freelance lumber work. There's some pretty odd characters. Leelanau Peninsula is a place that gets really huge in the summer in terms of population because it's the resort communities for Louisville. And then in the winter, it just really, you have to be hardcore to stay there because you got 260 inches of snow to have a conversation with. This is the woodcutters Leelanau. The main road through town is smeared with sweet cherries left by farmers on a whirlwind to a harvest of maybes. We step out of the forest, the Bohemian, Richard, the Indian, and I. Covered in wood chips from trees bigger than most people's ambition, ambling to our reward, Richard is always off the reservation, gets his tawny port, and we get light beers. Late August on the Lake Michigan feels early fall. The snow just can't wait to cover, but for a bit longer, the world lingers on these streets, hugging summer remnants on holiday, eating ice cream. It's Friday night, and we are still working, paying our penance for having no second home but a long, hard winter. If we yell and sing too loud, there's nobody to tell us. The wood chips, sweat and dirt, our camo. Tourists all look away or through us like we're part of the landscape. But we're clowns with chainsaws, a trio. Packed in a good time Ford truck, Richard christened the Red Demon. Today, after our day jobs, 70-year-old Richard felled a monster locust 10 stories tall. So, I mean, that's the thing. When I go out and report, I do this poetry thing. It never gets on the air. But I got all kinds of stuff like this because that's how you get an impression of a place and you experience it emotionally. So, one of the things I've noticed where it's Michigan or here, that this whole process of paving over swamps and farmlands short circuits the water cycle, causing flooding. It can also cloud our collective recollection of what a place was before it was improved. That orientation to the granular details of how we have altered the natural world around us is critical to understanding how those choices have made us even more vulnerable to a storm like Sandy. As part of planning for the next 100-year or 50-year storm and flooding event, we need to look back and see just what we have been up to since European settlers came to this continent. And while we can show disdain for those folks in the developing world who just can't seem to stop burning their rainforests, we've been leaving our mark on the planet as well. The U.S. Geological Survey reports that since the early 1600s, the continental U.S. has lost 53% of its wetlands, from 221 million acres to just over 100 million. Before Sandy, Irene demonstrated that from North Carolina up through the upper reaches of New England, our collective plumbing failed, and it killed dozens of people and cost billions to fix. It wasn't Katrina, but it affected 13 states and showed how totally inadequate our existing water management infrastructure was. It also graphically illustrated how thousands of bad local land use decisions, when hit by a storm the size of Europe, can all help produce a so-called natural disaster with continental consequences. The scope of the damage of these short-sighted land use practices that play out at the local level are so pernicious, the results can be seen from space. For decades, in pursuit of property tax revenues and economic development, we've built shopping malls in swamps, clear-cut forest, and paved over farmland for big box stores, while neglecting the existing infrastructure in our urban core. While the economic development model based on sprawl made some people extraordinarily rich, replacing naturally regulating systems, swamps, meadows, and farms with a mindless repetition of strip malls and fast food joints in state after state, leaving nowhere for the rainwater to go. In the process, the national sprawl has undermined the economic sustainability of many of our cities that struggle with thousands of abandoned homes and commercial structures standing vacant. Can we be surprised our basement floods when we put shopping malls in our swamps? In New Jersey, since the 1780s, we've lost almost 40% of our wetlands. We are now down to 915,000 acres of wetlands from 1.5 million in the colonial period. From 2002 through 2007, the Garden State lost more than 8,000 acres of wetlands, equivalent to the size of the Hackensack Meadowlands. The EPA reports that since the founding of the Republic, North Carolina has filled in almost half of its wetlands, Maryland 73%, Delaware 54%, Pennsylvania 56%, New York 60%, Connecticut 74%, and even Green Vermont destroyed 35% of its wetlands. In the 13-state swath cut by Irene, the post-World War II period has devastated farmland, which, like swamps and woodland, act as the ultimate sponge for rain and snow events. Farms provide a lot more than just food in densely populated corridors like the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. In a nation where every level of government finds itself pinched for cash for concrete projects that control water, it's more essential than ever we see swamps, forests, and farmland as the most cost-effective water management infrastructure. And we need to really consider undoing some of what we have done by buying out communities that now chronically flood and return them to their natural state as a wetland. New Jersey officials led by Governor Christie have repeatedly cited the state's Blue Acres program as a viable option for dealing with neighborhoods that were badly flooded in storms Sandy and Irene. The program buys property from homeowners and converts the area to a park. But for the thousands of New Jersey residents looking for a buyout, Blue Acres might as well be a unicorn. Just as along the coast, inland neighborhoods have to sort out whether they want to stay and fortify or lobby for a government buyout. For many who have suffered chronic flooding and can't afford another $50,000 to raise their foundations, they're stuck with homes nobody wants to buy. A New Jersey Blue Ribbon panel convened by Governor Christie after the catastrophic flooding from Irene found that in the Passaic River Basin alone, some 6,000 homes are facing repeat severe flooding. That panel calculated that to buy those homes would cost $3 billion, which is still cheaper than a massive floodwater management project. But so far, since the Blue Acres program was established in 2007, only 200 homes have been purchased, and the $36 million dedicated to the state fund is gone. The governor said that there's a $250 million appropriation coming from Washington to buy out hard-hit communities like Sayreville, but we haven't seen it yet. But here's the thing, even as we talk about buyouts throughout New Jersey and the region, we are seeing land use decisions that fly in the face of the environmental lessons we say we are learning post-Irene and Sandy. Consider the recent Army Corps approval of a permit for the developers of the American Dream Meadowlands, AKA Xanadu, to fill several acres of wetlands so they can build a water park. Thanks. That's it.
Now I'm going to run you through a quick Q&A with Mr. Hennelly. If you have questions, raise your hand and I'll approach you. Go right ahead. Questions?
You said we lost a lot of wetlands since New Jersey was founded, but exactly like how many acres did we lose?
Oh, it's about 39% since 1780. So you figure you're down to like 900,000 and change from about 1.5 million. I'm gonna make this available if you guys want. I'll put it together in a document form, and we could maybe you post it if you want, whatever you want to do with it.
I'm glad to meet you. I'm an admirer of you from NPR with Brian Lair. I've heard you, but I've always thought of you when you talked about politics and things like that, but I didn't know you were an environmentalist. When I was coming here today to this lecture, and I live in the suburbs of Essex County, and from the last storm, Sandy, our problem was trees falling down.
Right.
Now I'm seeing all my neighbors cutting good trees down because they're afraid they're going to fall on their houses. And I always believed that a tree was sacred, that you used to have to, you were fined if you cut a tree down. I'm not talking about a dead tree.
Right.
And you see the same thing down the shore. There's this constant conflict between local communities and the environment. How do we get around that?
Well, the issue about the hardwoods, it's funny, when I was, we had so many out-of-state crews here during both Irene and Sandy, from Missouri and places where they have tornadoes, and I would talk to these fellows, and they wouldn't go on tape because they'd lose their job, but they'd say, like, we just don't understand, are you people tree worshipers out here? Because out where we're from, where there's tornadoes, we don't have hardwoods anywhere near a power line. So I think that it has to do with our aesthetic here. I know in Mendham, because that housing stock is really old, and the land has been settled, you know, almost since the American Revolution. There's a lot of old trees that are there. Part of the problem has been that there has not been proactive pruning. I mean, one of the things that happened, particularly in Jersey Central Power and Light Territory, when they got taken over by FirstEnergy, they pretty much gutted the maintenance of Wakey. And so they let all that, when you don't cut weeds, what happens? They become trees. And so as a consequence, this is a case where they cut back the people that come and actually do the work, the critical work. They're that are around the power lines. And so that's, you know, one thing. Now, as far as the conflict, one of the things that is very interesting is to watch how post-Sandy we have Governor Cuomo's response about how to plan in relationship to the next storm. And he's actually embracing the reality of global warming as something to be factored into long-term investment decisions for infrastructure. Governor Christie pretty much hasn't gotten on board with that, but what he has done is he is now, you know, he's very strong about private property rights, but after seeing the damage in communities without dunes, he is now preparing to create legislation to give the state the power of condemnation to compel local beach property owners to put dunes in. And so, I mean, this is one of the things that is fascinating. You know, we're really at, the American Republic has had this kind of flexibility when it's been faced with certain kind of challenges. You know, during the lead up to the Civil War, when you read the debate in Congress, there were, you know, patriotic Americans who just could not imagine the United States getting on without slavery. People from New York in Congress, they couldn't imagine it. And so now we're in a place where we, and the founders really had a notion of a republic that had an infinite natural resource base, right? I mean, for all that they couldn't imagine you know, they had the Declaration of Independence and all of that, but to them, they hadn't even mapped the country yet. And so now we're in a time where we very much understand the limitations. So how do we use the current political system that exists to face these challenges, where you do have this tension between private property and the collective Commonwealth obligation of environmental sustainability? That's the tension.
I don't know if you talked about this because I came in a little late, but New Jersey is the Garden State. Did you talk about the loss of farms that are being turned into shopping centers and condominiums?
Well, and that's something that, yes, I did. And I think that one of the things that covering the issues of land use in New Jersey over the arc of what I'm 57, I wrote my first article when I was 17, so that's 40 years. One of the things that's happened is you have initiatives like the Highlands Act, and the state's got like attention deficit disorder. Like it has a spasm of activity, gets something done, and then we just don't follow up. And one of the things in the Highlands Act was supposed to be a mechanism to compensate farmers, because I don't know how much of you know, how many of you know about the Highlands Act? It's mixed, okay. New Jersey has this, and we're in it right now, this amazing 9-10 county area that's called the Highlands, that is the water producer for New Jersey. And it has a system of reservoirs, and it has, you know, just amazing natural resource base that somehow has managed to survive. And one of the problems with our development structure today is that each town develops and is responsible for its local land use. And because they are desperate to fund education, which they do through taxing the land, it forces them to continue to intensify the use of the land. And since they're only looking at their little, I'm from Madison, I don't want, here's what happens in Florham Park, I don't care. There's no regional consideration of the aggregate impact of the development. That's why I took you through that magical mystery tour from North Carolina to Maine, because these decisions are being made in isolation. And so as a consequence in the Highlands Act, it's very important to preserve the buffer area, the natural area around our water body that provides our potable water. Why is that? Well, if the farther you, the more distance you put in terms of natural environment between a water source and development and commerce, the better chances you have that it won't be contaminated. And when you have a certain critical mass of biomass in the form of trees, wetlands, and farmland, you hold on to the water better. So it's both a quantity and quality question. Development short circuits that. In the Highlands Act, the notion was, let's have a Highlands Council where they look at development in a regional context, because that's the way to make the state more sustainable. The piece they didn't follow through on, which is typical of Trenton, was the funding mechanism to compensate property owners when, because of the environmental consciousness, they could no longer develop their land. And this has real consequences for farming, because what happened is family farms are funded in terms of their financial structure. Do we have any finance majors here? That's too bad. Let's recruit some more for next Earth Day. Got to get them in the house. What happens with a family farm is you go to the bank and you have this land, you have 200 acres, and its real value has been, up until recently, as residential development, right? And so figure a quarter-acre zoning, you have 200, you go and say, I've got so many housing lots, and the bank lends you money based on the potential development value of it. Now, you're a committed farmer. You never intend on developing it, but you take that capital and you build the little maple syrup shack, you buy your equipment, and it permits you to fund agriculture. So when the Highlands Act came in and basically said this land's off the table, what happens? It collapses the agricultural economy because the banks start calling the paper. So that's the piece that needs to happen in terms of farmland preservation in the Highlands, is some kind of water tax that for the water that leaves the region. There should be like a 1 cent a gallon or some kind of tax And I think that way you could fund the farmers and then compensate them for this taking, so that we have a chance of preserving their farms. Otherwise, we'll see continued loss of farmland. Any other questions?
Has there, in response to this last hurricane, has there been any chatter about taking the land along the ocean by eminent domain so that they can't rebuild where all these houses were destroyed?
Well, and it's funny because that gets to the heart of the debate. There's, as I said, Governor Cuomo and his plans and application of Washington has been far more aggressive and has used exactly that language. The problem with our Blue Acres program is conceived so far as it's voluntary and requires that you get to a certain critical number of people in a community to agree. And that's a good point. Right now, when the FEMA maps came out, when Governor Christie embraced the original initial FEMA maps, there was a howl from local governments and local landowners because the consequence of being rated as a high-risk area was considerable, because it meant that your flood insurance went up and the rateable value, the town suffered because they lost land that was developable or that could be redeveloped. And so one of the things that has to be examined here, and it's a heavy lift, and it will probably make Trenton get a frowny face, but they're just going to have to break this linkage between land use and taxation, because they're driving this state into oblivion. I mean, it's having the most pernicious effects. I mean, forget the fact the amount of, when I had to cover that story, biggest writing challenge ever was that, you may remember that caper with the 44 elected officials that were all arrested. There's everything from organ trafficking to payoffs for buildings. I was like, how am I going to put this in 100 words for the top of the hour? Anything else?
I couldn't help to notice that you mentioned during your speech about the piece of the highway of 287 that was washed away into the Rockaway River, and I drive through that every day. And I remember, and still to this day, I go on that lane. But anyways, in the last 2 years with Hurricane Irene and Sandy, we have really seen in New Jersey firsthand the kind of damage that a natural disaster of that sort can make. And we're talking about the infrastructure in New Jersey. How do you think we're preparing for, I hope we don't have another storm like that this year, but how do you think New Jersey is preparing, and whether are we doing a good job or a decent job or a terrible job sort of getting ready for whatever may be coming up next?
Well, I think the consensus, the problem here, and it's funny because we would play with the governor. I had this surreal assignment. The second day after Irene, we're in total third world darkness in Mendham. JCP&L just, I don't know, we didn't see a truck. In fact, the local OEM guy told the cops to span out and look for any JCP&L trucks. And several days went by and couldn't find one. And I think it's very important. We kind of get on with our life and forget how catastrophic it was to lose 90% of the power infrastructure. And so part of the problem with this is that once we get on with our day and, a couple of pay periods go by, a couple of mortgage payments go by, that wasn't so bad. In retrospect, it was kind of fun. I had candlelight, But in my town, to give you, and why this is not, it's very important to keep telling these stories. And I may bring, some other time, bring a poem by that gets at this. In Mendham alone, there were 700 households that have well water, that when you get into the third or fourth day without electric power, you have a health issue. Throughout the state of New Jersey, if you read the list of people that died, the elderly people living alone, because of the lack of preparedness by the state, these deferred decisions have a consequence. I was very proud of the way our local community responded. They used the Meals on Wheel list for people who are homebound and went out and got them and brought them to the firehouse. But even now, I don't really think that the state has done what it needs to do. One of the things that needs to happen is, under existing law, believe it or not, local emergency officials and first responders are not supposed to touch electrical lines when they're down. And so you had a wide range of response throughout all 565 towns, now that the Princeton's merged, with some OEMs saying, I can't afford to let the streets stay in this condition, and taking direct action and having the DPWs actually move the trees and the power lines. To this day, if that happened again, there's been no change in the law that gives the power to the local OEM official to act directly. I mean, one of the things that needs to happen immediately is 2 workers from every DPW in the state of New Jersey need to be certified to handle power lines, like yesterday. Because the inability to move, you could have people that you couldn't get somewhere because of this dysfunction. So we've got to keep telling these stories, make poems, small musicals, to remind ourselves of what happened so we can keep the momentum for change. Anybody else? This is fun to get to see the people asking you questions, except you're in the, and Brian, you know, like, incoming! I'm from Sea Caucus, okay.
I have 2 comments. The first one is a question. It's like, how is the groundwater affected by all of this? And I did environmental studies too, so I partially know, but I'd like to hear it from you. And the other thing is, not only during something like Sandy do we need the DPWs to be set up like that, but that early snowstorm that we had, I was working over in Chatham, and I saw the stuff start to come down, the ice, and I left work early, drove home from Chatham, and I lived in East Hanover, and I heard trees cracking. I had to go around trees that were pulling power lines down. Those kinds of events are happening as well, and we need first responders, you know,
Right.
license for those as well. So.
Well, right, and I think one of the things that happened, I mean, I remember once again, senior citizens were spot on. The hearings related to JCP&L being taken over by the mothership FirstEnergy, okay? And at the time, the folks who've been around said, do not sell your utility to an out-of-state corporation. And they said they'll lay off the maintenance of way workers, and all of that came to pass. Now JCP&L is in a serious rate hearing case, and the allegation is that they moved $80 million that was supposed to be used to maintain the rate base and maintain this as part of the bottom line in Ohio. I mean, keep in mind, do you remember the Great American Blackout, anybody, where we took out Canada, and you know that was a FirstEnergy production, you know that? That was brought to you by FirstEnergy. See, the way this works with regulators, with the government, they do hearings, and they take on such a life of their own, and they go on for so long. 3 years later, the federal energy regulators come out with a tome that tells you that it was because FirstEnergy did not maintain their maintenance of way, weeds become trees, and it took out a power line that caused this blackout. And so part of the dynamic here that's happened is people need to take responsibility for, go to the hearings about the BPU. I mean, I watched this kind of depressing as a reporter. Right after Sandy, everyone was out, there was outrage, rooms were packed. And then as time went by, you know, 2 or 3 of the same people who don't have a life come. And then halls like this are empty, and the executives say, oh, dodge that bullet, and we're on to the next fiasco. Anybody else?
Hi, thank you very much. You had mentioned local municipalities then create regional problems.
Right.
Are you seeing any local sustainable change in terms of municipalities becoming green? Can we go backwards now and start at the local level and create change at the regional level?
The best thing that's happening has been, this is a caper, one of my first, looking at some of you folks may remember this, but this up in Bergen County, I mean, some of these companies just have no shame. The Hackensack Water Company had a bunch of reservoir land that it had used condemnation to get a hold of, that it had around its reservoirs up in Oradell and wherever. And they decided that they would transfer it for $1 to their own development company and sell it as waterfront development and condos. And then they said they didn't need all this land that they had accumulated and taken away from farmers since the 19th century because they had a new technology, a chemical technology that would magically clean the water. So they no longer needed the natural resource base around it. And a local environmental movement came up out of that, and a watershed group called SWAN, Save the Watershed Action Network, came to be. And I will have to say that in a period of time of declining volunteerism, where it's hard to get a full complement for the fire department and police department, or ambulance squad, there has been this network of watershed associations that has transformed the political landscape. And that overlay is why the Highlands Act got passed. So, and these watershed associations become a permanent witness to what happens. And that usually means that you have people from different towns who understand the nature of the water system. And I think ultimately what has to happen is it would be great to see municipalities down the line reorganize based on these features. I mean, right now, the political subdivisions are not working. The way we've constructed this is based, I don't know what, on a dear friend and somewhat of a mentor, Alan Karcher, the speaker, wrote this great book, Municipal Madness, which describes New Jersey's proliferation of local governments. I've been doing this for 40 years. Only 2 towns have gone out of business. Pequari, population 13, on the Delaware, they just ran out of people to be elected. And then, and then you have the Princetons, which went through something like, New Jersey Housewives. They had like 10 votes and finally merged. And so, actually, when you think about it, this is our country. We can revisualize it any way we want. This current structure of municipal government is unsustainable economically and ecologically. It just is. And I love, my town. Mendham Township and Mendham Borough, okay? We have 2 police forces. Really? We have 460 some odd police forces in New Jersey, and we couldn't merge the Mendhams because there were 2 high-ranking police officers that didn't want to take a hit with their pensions. So I think there's an opportunity, actually, to reimagine New Jersey with an ecological and economic imperative. Anybody else? Well, this is fun. I'm talking about stuff I'd never anticipated talking about.
Can you point us to a place where we might find what is being done in New Jersey, where there might be a plan that would also lead to some enlightenment on what's not being done that might be fixable?
Environmentally wise? Yeah. I think that the Sierra Club and Jeff Tittle's done a very good job flagging issues. I think that the New Jersey, we have a resource very close by Del Barton, the New Jersey Environmental Association of Environmental Commissions. It's right there in the Parks building. And then also the local Watersheds Association, and that's another thing. I think it's very important for yourself, and I did this course at Ramapo called Environmental Journalism, but it's really a form of citizenship at this point. I would suggest a couple of things. Does everyone know what a geological survey map is? GS map. And find your home on it. And then once you find your home on it, figure out where is your water source. Then figure out where does your wastewater go. And then figure out, get an EPA map of where there are Superfund sites nearby you. And you will find that way you're really animated. You are then an informed citizen. You now fully are taking responsibility for having the orientation of the planet and the community you live in. Yes?
This is about a different kind of green. What are the current estimates of the tax implications of lost revenue at the shore this year?
That's a multifaceted question. First of all, the estimate is there'll be a $5 billion loss in the way of ratables to local governments, and that's significant. There are dozens of towns that have properties that have lost dramatic value. In some cases, aren't even on the planet anymore because they were taken by the ocean. And then there is the consequence of sales tax revenue. And so we are currently running about $300 million behind projected revenue. There is some optimistic thought that the additional construction will offset some of what's been lost. The big problem for the shore communities, and I tell you, traveling with the governor, I've spent more time in the Jersey Shore in the winter than I did since college. I'm like, oh, I was here 30 years ago. And one of the things that's difficult for the shore communities is many of them are in great shape, but the perception is that they're not. And so they're going to spend $25 million in a tourist campaign, and of course I had to be a stickler and ask Governor Christie, are you going to appear in those ads in an election year? He hasn't made his mind up yet. I mean, I think the sales tax revenue was one big hit. There was another big hit in terms of the loss of businesses and income tax revenue. But one of the things that's kind of saved us, like in the last 4 months, our revenues have been running ahead of projection. And also, there was a little bit of a silver lining from all the tax craziness. Like, people rushed to pay their taxes at the end of last year because they wanted to stay ahead of the tax increase that did come for the upper 1%. So it's a mixed bag. I think the real issue is long-term, these municipalities, you know, in Katrina, municipal aid continued in that area from Washington for several years. That's a direct supplemental aid to kind of fix, to kind of hold the place for the local communities that are losing this revenue.
I don't know if this is a comment or a question. I live in Maplewood, and we are an environmentally, interested community. But the most interesting thing was when all the power lines went down, there were generators everywhere. One of the things we talk about is not running our engines and not idling our vehicles, except what I saw was that everybody was running those generators, which didn't have any catalytic converter or anything attached to them. So, many people are now thinking, I'm putting a generator, I'm going to get a generator attached to my home, I don't care if it's $8,000 or whatever. So have you done any research on the generators and people purchasing in the state or anything about that?
I have to say that what's happened is the social contract of publicly available property electricity collapses, who knows how the public's going to handle it. I mean, I saw some behavior that was very strange. And I'd report it to the desk, and that can't be happening. I mean, the gas lines, we're a people that consider it a birthright to go wherever we want, whenever we want. And to not have, I'm going to say one anecdote. I was on Ridge Avenue, because it was great, just doing my life was news. So out to get gas, hunter-gatherer, this is what's left, 21st century. I got my jerry cans, I'm talking to Brian Lair. And then I look up the Vero station, and then there's a Gulf station there on Ridge Avenue. And there's people standing around, it's all really third world, like, Nigeria, everybody's waiting for their gas canister off the hijacked gasoline line. And I see things that I know are not proper in terms of handling wholesale quantities of gasoline. I don't think that you should take your town and country with a baby seat in it, and while your child's in it, surround them with jerry cans. I don't think that's the way to go. So, this is all new for us, roughing it. And so I'm standing in line, and having great conversations. I'm learning, there's so many unemployed great executives around. Really, it's an opportunity for me just walking around now. There's such a brain drain just walking the pavement. Nice people. Ex-AT&T guy told me there's something called plastic utility poles that they've developed that can't snap. that evidently exist that can have a long life. Anyway, I'm 150 people line, get my jerry cans. 3 people before that magical moment where I'm going to get my gasoline, they run out. Now, across the street is the Valero, but they have a different business model. They have a sign that says, gasoline only for customers of Mercedes-Benz of Morristown. So there's this weird tension, like a couple hundred people of every kind. In Morristown now we're speaking 50 languages. And so there's police, and we all kind of well, I kind of walked, but people ran into traffic to go to the Valero. So the guy at Valero is taking care of the Mercedes-Benz, and all of a sudden it's like, he's got a problem. So some very smart, handsome lieutenant from Morristown, I know his name, just went up to the guy, put his hand on him and said, I know this is the business plan you had for today, but just now in the interest of public safety, you're going to accommodate these people. And thus for an hour we nationalized Valero. Are we exhausted now?
There's no more questions.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Mr. Henley for
Thanks
coming
very
by.
much.